Hello, everyone. My name is Annika Vorhes, and I'm going to be walking you through week 1 of EDT 8130. This session is a recorded session. In 2 weeks, we'll be having a live session. So what I want to do first is walk you through what you need to do to make sure everything is set up and good to go to join a live session, although some of these are really important for the recorded session as well. So first, you're going to need to set up your camera and microphone. Really important that the audio is working because we do a lot of interaction in the live class. So you want to make sure that your audio is working and sounds good. This way, when you are talking to the class, everyone's able to hear you and it's clear and we're able to use it. Video, you want to check that as well, although we don't use that very often. You do want to make sure it's working just in case we decide to use it that day. You also, and this is particularly important for those in the recorded session as well. I know you're not really using the camera and the audio in the recorded sessions, but this you will use in the recorded sessions as well as the live lessons. You want to make sure that the chat panel is ready to go. We do use that a lot for activities, and you're going to be able to use that as you follow along in the recorded sessions to see what's going on, see the discussions that are happening throughout the class. So make sure that's ready to go. All right, you also need to prepare your learning space. That may mean seeing your phone, shutting your door. For me, that means kicking my dog out of the room because every time I start recording something, she decides to try and join the conversation. So make sure, no matter what it means for you, that your learning space is ready to go. And that really does apply to both those attending a live session and a recorded session. When you're entering a learning space, you want to make sure that you're prepared. All right, and normally we're going to take a little more time to run through the quality check, but since this is an asynchronous session, I'm just going to run through it real quick. Typically, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you see the red record button. Then we're going to move on to making sure that you can see the quality check at the top. That's to make sure you can see everything happening on the screen. Then we're going to have you raise your hand if you can hear me. Of course, that's an important part. If you do have any problems with this recording, of course, contact me immediately so I can make any adjustments needed. All right. So week 1 is January 19th. So for everyone, I want you to complete session notes, as whether you're attending live or watching the recorded session. Now, how you go about those notes is completely up to you. Whatever method works best for you. Some like stream of consciousness, some like more structured notes, some like to do them after the session is ended. It's completely up to you how you go about doing it. Just include a few things. You want to hit the main points. This is more for you so you don't forget what the session was about. You also want to include your own thoughts as you're going through the lesson. It's going to help you remember if you're making connections to the material as we go through it. You're more than welcome to include questions in your notes. Those can be for you, questions you're coming up with as you go through, or actual questions for me. Now, here's where the two are a little bit different. For the live listeners, you're going to be doing the activities during the live session, so you're not going to need to include that in your notes. But for those in the recorded sessions, you will need to include those activities in your notes. All right. All right, so this week we're going to be digging into a couple different concepts: collaborative thinking, critical thinking. I'm going to be asking you to reflect on some prior experiences and to start thinking about ways to create this collaborative thinking in your class, in your training, however you're going to be applying this. All right, so collaboration. When you hear this word, what do you think of? Take just a moment, pause. I want you to select an image that to you represents collaboration. It can be positive, negative, whatever pops to mind. please look up an image and put that in your notes. Okay, so collaboration brings up a lot of different thoughts for people. Unfortunately, because I teach in higher ed as one of my jobs, it often has a negative connotation because of past experiences that students have had with it. And when they talk about it, talking about group work. Now, I have my own opinion on group work, but that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is real collaboration and collaboration of ideas, right? Really discussing ideas, meanings, texts, all different things to get to this higher knowledge. Because if you read something and just take that as truth, you're not really digging into it, right? You're just listening and passively accepting the information. Now that's where critical thinking comes in. We have to move beyond just the Freire banking method of teaching, where we see instructors just giving the information to students, expecting them to just absorb it and regurgitate that information in an exam. It's antithetical to what we do because what we're trying to do is really get students to actively be a part of their learning and engage with the information. So when critical thinking is brought up, yes, it's a term that is thrown around quite a bit, right? We hear it all the time in higher education. And because I teach a lot of first-year composition courses, I hear it all the time. But what we're actually talking about when we talk about critical thinking is taking information and really looking at it. So not just reading it and accepting it as truth, but moving beyond that. So in this age of technology where we have all kinds of information, there's constant flow of information from all kinds of sources. How do we deal with that? Well, we have to question it. And we question, who wrote it? Why did they write it? What was their purpose in putting this information out there? Tracing back where the information came from, discussing it with people, getting lots of perspectives, because your own positionality and subjectivity often get in the way of really thinking about something and going beyond that confirmation bias of having our own thoughts reflected back to us, reading things from one organization that we know has the same views as us and avoiding other perspectives because they disagree with what we think. Well, that's not really digging in and learning and understanding an issue. You can't understand something unless you hear multiple sides and look at what's really going on. So as you can see, what we normally see when it comes to critical thinking and learning, it's largely absent from these big lectures, right? When we think about education, we often think about these huge lecture halls where students are just listening to someone drone on and on about a subject, whether they want to be in that class or not. And that's not what is really happening in most classes. That's the old way of doing things, and we're moving on to really think about ways that we can ignite passion and learning in our students. So how do we go about creating this? Well, a huge part of that is making questioning, challenging, part of the learning process. It means that we have to really encourage students to argue with their texts, not in a bad way, but in a way where they're engaging with it and trying to figure out if the information they're getting is true or not, and what's missing from that information, what bias is already embedded in that information. And there always is. It's just a matter of doing more research and figuring out where the truth lies, where questions lie, and how we can learn from each other by discussing these things and having real, meaningful, productive discourse surrounding the subject matter or the specific text that's been brought up, or a specific idea that's been brought up, and knowing how to do that in a way that is respectful of one another's positionalities and subjectivities, and also challenging one another to think deeper, think more, as they move through the course or program or training or what have you. But there has to be that moment where they understand that questioning is part of the learning process, and it's an important part to not just accept things as truth. All right, so now I want you to take a second after I'm finished speaking here, pause the video and think about collaboration and the ways that you have collaborated with others in your workspace, in your educational experience. And this time I want you to think about a time when it just went wrong. And why did it go so wrong? So pause the video now and think about that. Write it in your notes. Okay, so I think we all have times when even critical, thoughtful collaboration goes wrong. And I know in my experience, it happens when someone is very beholden to an idea and they don't want to examine that idea, and it can make very, very difficult. I'm sure you have lots of experiences as well, because it doesn't go perfect every time. That's not how things work. But how do you get it back on track? Well, there are pretty easy ways to do that, as long as you know how to navigate and start asking productive questions and moving away from parts of the conversation that are non-productive. But creating a critical, collaborative environment can be difficult. It is challenging. It isn't what we're taught to do, particularly in classrooms. It means changing that student-teacher dynamic that we're so accustomed to. It means really putting students in control of their own learning. So how would you create a learning environment that really encourages us to question and work together to figure out what it is they're working on? Of course, this, can be applied to any text, any class. It just shifts. Take just a moment. Well, not just a moment. It's going to be a few minutes. And watch this video. I'm going to put the link here in our chat. When you're done, I've just put it in the chat. When you've finished watching the video, I want you to head to our Canvas page, to our group discussion. You'll see it's already labeled. And I want you to describe how you would go about creating a collaborative thinking environment for wherever you're coming from, whether that's higher ed, K-12, training, whatever environment you're in, whatever your professional environment is. How would you go about trying to create that? Now, you don't need to lay everything out. You just need to have a few ideas of what you would do, and share that with the class. So pause this and head to the video, take a look at that, go to our Canvas site, and then come back. All right. So we covered a lot of material today. Trying to cover collaboration and critical thinking together is huge, and it's so, so important. And we're going to continue working on that as we keep reading our Thinking Collaboratively, Learning in a Community of Inquiry. We're going to keep learning about this and keep developing it and keep building on this basic knowledge of, yes, critical thinking and collaboration are hugely important when it comes to learning in any environment. So keep reading, prepare for the discussions. By preparing, that means actually reading and writing out any questions you have or thoughts you have in preparation for the discussions. And in 2 weeks, we're going to have a live session. Of course, you're welcome to attend the live session or watch the recording. Either way, be ready for discussion. All right? Thank you. See you in 2 weeks.